The air is thick with the stench of sweat and fear in London's Smithfield, August 23, 1305. A man, bound and bloodied, is dragged through a mob that howls like a beast unchained. His flesh is raw from the ropes that pull him, his body battered from days of torment. This man is William Wallace, Scotland's most defiant son, and he is about to endure one of the most grotesque punishments ever devised by human cruelty. Stripped naked, tied to the tail of a horse, Wallace is pulled across the cobblestones toward a wooden platform where the king's justice waits. The sentence is no ordinary death. He will be castrated, disemboweled, his entrails burned before his own eyes, his body quartered, while still alive. The crowd leans in eager, some jeering, some silent with dread, their faces lit by the cruel gleam of August's sun. Wallace's chest heaves, but his eyes burn with something untamable, an unyielding resolve that no chain, no blade, no king could extinguish. This is not legend. This is history. The horrific, gut-wrenching end of a man who dared to defy an empire. And as you listen, remember, the archives of history are not places of comfort. They are vaults of agony, cruelty, and the naked hunger for power. What you're about to hear is a descent, step by step, into the dark machinery of conquest, betrayal, and execution. If you have the strength to follow it, lean closer, and before we continue, let me ask you, where are you listening from and why are you drawn into these forbidden shadows of history? Write it in the comments below because stories like these should never be forgotten. The tale begins not with Wallace's death, but with the chains England tried to wrap around Scotland. It is 1296 and Edward I, Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, has swept north with an army of knights and mercenaries. Scotland's king John Balliol has been humiliated, stripped of his crown, his lands seized. Castles fall like autumn leaves under English steel. The nobility bends their knees, some out of survival, others for gold. The nation is fractured, its spirit broken. But into this wasteland steps a man not born of high blood. William Wallace, son of a minor landholder from Elderslie, stands nearly 7 feet tall, a giant in stature and in will. His early years are cloaked in shadow. Some claim he was educated by monks, others that he learned his craft as a soldier wandering Europe. What is certain is this: Wallace was not content to kneel. He was carved from defiance, a spirit too vast to be caged by England's yoke. The spark comes, as sparks often do, from personal tragedy. In 1291, or so the whispers tell it, Wallace's wife, Marion Braveheart, is slain by English soldiers after Wallace avenges her assault by killing their sheriff. Whether every detail is true matters less than the pain it reflects. Something deep in him ruptured. Grief sharpened into fury. Outlawed, he fled to the forests, gathering around him a band of dispossessed men, farmers, shepherds, outcasts. They were not an army but a promise. By 1297, Wallace's promise became fire. That September at Stirling Bridge, his ragged force of spearmen lured the pride of England into a trap. The narrow wooden bridge was the English army's undoing. Wallace held his men until the river swelled with soldiers halfway across. Then, like a hammer striking glass, the Scots closed in. The bridge collapsed under the weight of bodies, the river choked with the drowned. Over 5,000 English dead. Wallace stood triumphant, not just as a warrior, but as a living embodiment of Scotland's defiance. In the wake of Stirling, Wallace was knighted, named Guardian of Scotland. A commoner now carried the weight of a nation. But victories in history are never final. They are preludes to bloodier reckonings. And Edward I was not a king to forgive rebellion. He would answer with fire and arrows. The wind over the Scottish hills whispers of revenge. Wallace, now Guardian, knows his triumph at Stirling is fragile. Edward Longshanks is a veteran of endless wars, ruthless, calculating, his mind sharpened by decades of conquest. By 1298, he marches north himself with a host of 15,000 men. The English come like a storm, knights in iron, Welsh archers with their longbows, mercenaries hardened by pay and plunder. Wallace's army, though brave, is outnumbered. At Falkirk, he tries a desperate gamble. His men form into schiltrons, great circles bristling with spears, a wall of wood meant to repel cavalry. For a moment it works. English horses rear back, impaled on the forest of pikes. But Edward's archers step forward. The sky darkens. Arrows fall like a rain of death, ripping through flesh, piercing lungs, tearing hope apart. The Scottish lines shatter. Falkirk is a disaster. Thousands dead. The dream of freedom drowned in blood. Yet amid the ruin, Wallace does not beg for pardon. He does not flee into exile. He vanishes into the wild, his body a shadow slipping between the mountains, his spirit unbroken. From this point, Wallace lives as a fugitive. He sleeps in caves, eats what he can scavenge, his skin scarred, his mind carved by grief. His raids continue, small, sharp, stinging like a wolf's bite. He burns supply trains, slaughters garrisons, cuts England's grip where it is weakest. To Edward he becomes a phantom, an irritant too dangerous to ignore. But Edward is patient. He buys loyalty where he cannot earn it. Nobles who once fought with Wallace begin to drift. Robert the Bruce himself, future king, walks a dangerous line between rebellion and submission. Wallace, the commoner, carries on almost alone. His vision of Scotland free is now sustained less by armies than by will. The years pass and by 1304 Scotland buckles. One castle after another falls. Wallace is hunted more fiercely than ever. Yet he does not kneel. His defiance is not for himself. It is for something greater, something eternal. A Scotland that could choose its own fate. And that makes him far more dangerous than any army. Still, every hunter waits for betrayal. And betrayal is coming. It is August 1305. The torchlight of a quiet chamber near Glasgow flickers against stone walls. Wallace meets with an ally, John de Menteith, a knight who has sworn loyalty. They speak in low voices, plotting one last uprising. But the air is too tense, the silence too sharp. The doors burst open. English soldiers flood the room, steel flashing. Wallace lunges, fighting like a beast cornered, his strength legendary even now. But there are too many. Blades smash into him, chains are thrown, and the defiant giant is dragged to the ground. Menteith has betrayed him. For gold, for land, for survival, he sold his friend to the very enemy they bled to fight. Betrayal cuts deeper than any sword. Wallace is dragged south, shackled in iron. His journey to London is a parade of humiliation. Villages jeer, hurling stones and filth. He is spat upon, mocked, paraded like a beast in chains. Yet even in this his gaze does not lower. He says little. Witnesses speak of his eyes, eyes that burn not with defeat, but with something unreachable, something the English could not break. In Westminster Hall, Wallace stands trial. The charges are absurd: robbery, arson, murder, and worst of all, treason. But Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward. How could he betray a king he never served? The trial is not justice, it is theater. He is given no chance to defend himself. His fate is already written. The sentence: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The most brutal punishment England reserved for its worst enemies. But this was not punishment, it was spectacle. A lesson. A message carved into flesh. And so Wallace is led to Smithfield. The scaffold awaits. The crowd surges. The executioners sharpen their blades. And the descent into horror begins. Smithfield, London. The heart of the beast. The marketplace where cattle are slaughtered now becomes a theater of human cruelty. August 23, 1305. The day William Wallace is offered to the mob as both a warning and a sacrifice. Dragged behind horses, Wallace arrives stripped of dignity, his skin torn raw by stone and iron. The crowd surges forward, their hunger not for bread or wine but for blood. Merchants, beggars, nobles, and even children press shoulder to shoulder. They are here not to witness justice, but to savor a spectacle designed by the crown itself. This is punishment as propaganda. The executioners waste no time. Wallace is forced to his knees, his chest heaving, his hands bound so tight that blood drips from his wrists. The first stage is the hanging. A noose is flung around his neck, tightened until his face darkens, his breath torn from him. But they do not let him die. The rope is cut. Wallace collapses, gasping, pulled back into the waking world of agony. The purpose is not death, but suffering. Next comes the blade. Before the roaring mob, the executioner seizes Wallace and castrates him, severing his manhood, holding it aloft as the crowd howls. The wound gushes. Pain tears through him like fire. Yet Wallace makes no sound, no cry that history records. Silence is his rebellion. Still conscious, Wallace is thrown onto the block. The executioner slices open his abdomen, his entrails spilling. His stomach heaves, his body convulses. One by one his organs are pulled free, his bowels, his liver, thrown onto the fire before his fading eyes. The smell of burning flesh drifts through Smithfield, mingling with sweat, with laughter, with screams. This is not death, it is desecration. A man unmade, piece by piece, while his spirit refuses to break. And still Wallace lives. The scaffold drips with blood, the crowd drunk on cruelty. Yet the ritual is not complete. England's justice demands not only death, but annihilation, body and memory both shattered. Wallace, barely clinging to consciousness, is dragged once more to the block. The axe rises. It falls. His head is severed in one brutal stroke. At last, the giant collapses into silence. But even in death, Edward Longshanks will not allow him rest. The executioners take his head, tar it to preserve it, and mount it on a pike above London Bridge. His limbs are quartered, his body dismembered like carrion. Each part is sent to a different city: Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, Stirling. Every town that once whispered of freedom now displays the butchered flesh of Scotland's champion. This is terror carved into geography, a warning etched in bone. But here is the paradox that tyrants never understand. Violence can kill a body, but it cannot kill an idea. Wallace's flesh was scattered to the winds, yet his defiance grew stronger in death than it had in life. The very act meant to erase him immortalized him. His silence at the scaffold, his refusal to beg, his unbreakable stare, these became legends too vast for England to smother. And so, in the blood-soaked dirt of Smithfield, something began that Longshanks did not foresee. Wallace's death did not extinguish rebellion. It fertilized it. In the years after 1305, Scotland burned again. The memory of Wallace became a ghost that walked among the hills and lochs, whispering vengeance. Farmers spoke of him as though he still rode in the night. Mothers told their children his name like a prayer. His silence at Smithfield became Scotland's voice. The man who took up that voice was Robert the Bruce. Once hesitant, torn between submission and rebellion, Bruce now saw in Wallace's martyrdom a path he could no longer ignore. In 1314, less than a decade after Wallace's execution, Bruce faced Edward II, the son of Longshanks, at Bannockburn. And there, the Scots struck the English crown a blow it would never forget. Bannockburn was not just victory, it was vindication. Wallace's blood had not been spilled in vain. But the deeper truth is this: Wallace's death was never about him alone. It was about power's eternal hunger to make examples of those who resist. The brutality of his execution was not unique. It was part of a machinery designed to terrorize populations into obedience. The Middle Ages were a crucible where rulers discovered how spectacle could enforce control. The scaffold as theater, the mob as accomplice, the body as warning. And yet, again and again this cruelty backfired. The blood of martyrs waters the soil of rebellion. The crown sought to erase Wallace, but instead it carved his name into eternity. Think of this whenever you hear history sanitized into tales of kings and crowns. Behind the pageantry lies the reality: mutilation, betrayal, and death inflicted to sustain power. Wallace's agony is not isolated, it is a mirror. From Rome to London, from Smithfield to every corner of empire, rulers have always known that terror is the surest chain. But they forget: chains rust, flesh rots, kings die. Memory endures. And Wallace is memory incarnate. The death of William Wallace was not merely an end, it was an experiment. Edward I believed that terror could be more effective than swords or treaties. By turning Wallace's body into a spectacle, he hoped to brand fear into the marrow of Scotland. This was not new. The medieval world had perfected cruelty as communication. Punishment was theater. Gallows were erected not in shadow but in the town square, where the largest crowds could gather. Each execution was a sermon, each mutilation a proclamation. This is what happens to those who resist. The greater the rebel, the greater the cruelty required. Wallace was the greatest of them all. His execution had to be unmatched, unforgettable. And it was. But in that theater of cruelty something else occurred, something the architects of power did not foresee. Horror has a twin: memory. When a man suffers silently, when he does not cry, when he refuses to beg, the very spectacle meant to humiliate him becomes inverted. Wallace was not reduced. He was exalted. In the Scottish imagination, his silence became louder than the mob's roar. His agony became a banner. His dismembered body, scattered to the corners of the kingdom, became an unkillable ghost. Every limb nailed above a gate became a shrine of defiance. The English wanted Wallace's name cursed. Instead, it was whispered with reverence. This is the paradox of oppression. Brutality can silence the body, but it cannot silence the idea. In fact, the deeper the cruelty, the stronger the myth. Wallace's execution was supposed to be the final act. Instead, it was the beginning of something larger, a legend that would pass from father to son, a whisper that would guide generations. And Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, unknowingly forged a martyr. To understand Wallace's death, you must understand Edward's mind. Longshanks was no mad tyrant, no reckless butcher. He was calculated. He used pain as strategy. His entire reign was a tapestry of psychological warfare. Consider his wars in Wales. After crushing the last Welsh princes, Edward ordered castles so massive they dwarfed anything the land had seen before: Conwy, Carnarvon, Harlech. They were not just fortresses, they were monuments. Symbols of domination carved in stone, designed to loom over the conquered like permanent shadows. Now turn to Scotland. Edward knew walls alone could not break a people. Terror had to seep into their blood. That is why Wallace's death was staged as it was. Not a private beheading. Not a simple hanging. But the full ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, reserved for traitors of the highest order. Wallace had never sworn allegiance, but Edward's truth was simple: rebellion itself was treason, whether lawful or not. And so Wallace's mutilation was a lesson. The noose was not to kill him, but to humiliate him. The castration was not only to cause pain, but to unman him, to strip away virility, to mock his defiance. The disembowelment, the burning of entrails, this was desecration, meant to say, your very insides belong to the crown. Finally, the quartering ensured he could not even rest in the soil of his homeland. His flesh became a warning pinned above the gates of Scotland's towns. This was terror perfected. The medieval crown knew that spectacle was the true weapon of empire. Armies could be defeated. Castles could fall. But fear lingers. It seeps into the soul, it bends generations. But Edward overlooked one thing. Fear is powerful, yes. But memory is stronger. After Wallace's death, Scotland did not fall silent. Instead, the whispers grew. Men spoke of his courage in the fields, in taverns, in the shadow of ruined churches. Mothers named their sons William. Minstrels wove ballads, turning his agony into poetry. The crown tried to erase him, but erasure is impossible when the blood of a martyr stains the land itself. Wallace's story became a seed, and it found its soil in the heart of Robert the Bruce. At first, Bruce had walked the path of compromise, bending when it suited him, calculating survival. But Wallace's defiance, his silence at the scaffold, was too sharp to ignore. It pierced Bruce like an arrow. By 1306, Bruce would raise the banner of rebellion once more, proclaiming himself King of Scots. The road ahead for Bruce was brutal: defeats, exiles, betrayals. But in 1314 at Bannockburn, he shattered the English might in a victory that echoed through the ages. Bannockburn was more than battle. It was vindication. It was Wallace's vengeance delivered through Bruce's sword. And yet, the deeper truth is this: Wallace's execution was not only about Scotland. It is about power itself. Its hunger to dominate, its obsession with spectacle, its need to turn the body into a message. From crucifixions in Rome, to burnings in medieval Europe, to guillotines in revolutionary France, the same pattern repeats. When rulers cannot silence an idea, they attack the flesh. They mutilate. They display. They make the body a billboard of terror. But history shows us again and again, it never works. The spectacle breeds resistance. The cruelty breeds memory. And memory is immortal. Wallace's flesh was quartered. But his story could not be. His silence at Smithfield was louder than Edward's cruelty, louder than the mob's laughter, louder than the roar of empire itself. Smithfield was not the only stage where empire displayed its cruelty. It was one of countless theaters across history where power learned how to mold flesh into symbols. The Romans crucified rebels on roadsides, their broken bodies nailed in rows that stretched for miles. The church later burned heretics in town squares, their screams rising with the smoke, a warning written in fire. Every age has its scaffold, every ruler his executioner. Wallace's torment was not unique, it was part of a continuum. What makes his story piercing is not the scale of pain, but the silence with which he endured it. Silence is resistance. Silence robs the executioner of his satisfaction. And silence transforms cruelty into legend. Edward I wanted Wallace's body to be a map of obedience, quartering him so that no Scot could escape the lesson. But instead, Wallace's scattered flesh became a map of rebellion. Each city that displayed a piece of him also displayed the truth. England feared one man so much that it could not simply kill him, it had to annihilate him. And what is more powerful than being feared by an empire? That fear is what carried Wallace beyond his grave. His death was not only martyrdom. It was revelation. Rulers need cruelty not because they are strong but because they are weak. Consider the psychology of spectacle. Why does power stage cruelty in public? Why not kill in silence behind closed doors? The answer is control. Public agony is theater, and theater manipulates the masses. The mob at Smithfield was not just an audience. It was part of the ritual. By watching, by cheering, even by recoiling in horror, they became accomplices in the crown's violence. This is how fear is manufactured. The crowd leaves not only with memories of Wallace's suffering, but with the imprint of dread. This could be you. That imprint shapes behavior far more effectively than decrees or taxes. Yet spectacle always risks inversion. The crown wants obedience, but the people may instead carry away admiration. They may whisper not of the king's power but of the rebel's courage. And when admiration outweighs fear, tyranny weakens. Wallace's silence turned Edward's theater inside out. What was meant as degradation became exaltation. What was meant as erasure became permanence. This is the forbidden truth of spectacle. Cruelty never controls as cleanly as rulers believe. It always plants seeds of rebellion. Wallace's legend outlived both Edward I and Edward II. It lived through Bruce's triumphs, through Scotland's declaration of Arbroath in 1320, through centuries of resistance. And in time Wallace ceased to be just a man. He became an archetype. By the 15th century, chroniclers like Blind Harry were weaving his story into poetry, elevating him into myth. Songs carried his name, and whispers turned into proclamations. Wallace was Scotland's eternal guardian, a symbol that could never be quartered. But this transformation also hides a darker truth. Myths are born from blood. Every heroic ballad is built on screams. Every legend of freedom is carved from entrails burned before jeering mobs. Wallace the myth is inspiring. Wallace the man was mutilated alive. To remember only the myth is to sanitize the horror. To remember the horror is to face the raw truth of power. This is what history often conceals. It prefers the palatable story, the hero's noble sacrifice, over the forbidden reality, that freedom is bought with gore, with fire, with silence in the face of unimaginable pain. So what does Wallace's death mean today? Why revisit the scaffold of Smithfield, the jeering mob, the entrails cast into fire? Because history is not past, it is pattern. Every empire has its Wallaces, every age its martyrs. Power still uses spectacle to control. Today the scaffolds are different, media screens instead of wooden platforms, prisons instead of marketplaces, but the principle is the same. Humiliation is broadcast. Defiance is punished with public ritual. Flesh is turned into message. Wallace's story is a mirror. It forces us to ask, what do rulers fear most? It is not armies. It is not castles. It is the individual who refuses to bend. The one who cannot be broken. The one who endures even when flesh is torn apart. Edward I believed he destroyed Wallace. But look at history. Wallace lives while Edward is remembered not as a king of glory, but as the butcher who failed to silence a commoner. This is the prophecy hidden in blood. Cruelty cannot kill truth. Spectacle cannot erase memory. Flesh rots, power shifts, empires collapse. But the silence of the defiant endures. And Wallace's silence still speaks.